All right. Well, thanks so much for having me here. It's a pleasure and an honor to get to speak to this group. So I'm going to talk today about my research on social cognition and theory of mind. This is research I've done in my lab over the past few years. So just to start by acknowledging the excellent students and postdocs who are the first authors on some of the research I'm going to tell you about today. So I'm going to assume a very diverse audience, and so I'm going to give background and introduction to each of the different elements of my research. So I'll start with some background on social cognition and theory of mind, then talk about some background on neuroimaging, and then get into the more recent research, starting with research we've published recently and finishing with a bunch of the research that is not yet published, stuff that's hot off the presses, still going on in the lab. All right, so just to start with the big picture, the problem that my lab has mostly tackled is theory of mind, how people think about, predict, reason, and explain what others think, want, and feel. This capacity, so our human capacity for thinking about other people in terms of their mental states, is hugely sensitive. We're able to recognize intentions and emotions and plans and feelings, even in extremely limited perceptual stimuli, the movements of triangles in this famous animation from the 40s, the heterosymbol animation that's perceived as having a good guy and a bad guy, often men and women, good goals and bad goals, positive feelings and negative feelings. It's also extremely early developing, so children begin to attend to other people as agents with goals and feelings very early on. Just as a demo, this is a film showing eye tracking data we collected from all preverbal infants. So they could look anywhere on the screen as this film evolves, and each dot is a child. You can see that across this group of children, everybody agrees on what's interesting about these scenes. It's the kids' faces and their hands, the places where they express their feelings and their goals. This capacity for thinking about other people's mental states starts with these perceptual abilities, but extends to some of our most abstract reasoning capacities. Just as an example of that, there's an apocryphal sentence attributed to Alan Greenspan, who apparently said once that, I know you think you understand what you thought I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard was not what I meant. So if you can make any sense of that sentence at all, right, that is a capacity to reason about the mental states of other people and their mental states about your mental states. It's quite remarkable. Part of where my research starts is with the realization that when you guys process that incredibly embedded sentence, understanding that sentence was a pattern of neural firing across neurons in space and time in your brain, which is to me one of the most exciting ideas I've ever thought, the idea that we could unpack understanding of something that complex and abstract into neural firing patterns. I'm going to try to argue today that the beginnings of that research program have become possible and that we're doing them. But just back off a little bit, I've been invited here by the Schools of Education and Public Health, and that raises the question, what does this fundamental basic research program have to do with education and public health? I think that's a really good question. Certainly, these capacities for social reasoning have educational implications. So early measures of children's ability to reason through social situations and think about other people's goals and feelings predict their school readiness, their school adjustment, their behavioral relationships with peers and with teachers, and their resilience to adversity in the form of, for example, bad parenting. So that suggests that we're studying a skill that's going to be fundamental to kids' abilities to thrive in school. Again, the public health implications at the bigger picture are obvious because social cognition is implicated as a symptom in many neural and developmental disorders, and in particular in the developmental disorders of autism spectrum disorders, which have a hugely rising prevalence with unclear etiology and no known treatment. So these questions about the human brain and its development as an organ of social cognition seem to be at the seat of many issues that could be of common interest to people with interest in education and public health, which is, I take it, why I'm here today. But having said all of that, I'm going to now just talk to you about my basic research. I'm trying to characterize cognitive and neural mechanisms underlying theory of mind. Again, to give a little more background on theory of mind has traditionally been studied mostly in children before school age, so kids age 2 till 5, and with a very intense focus on one developmental achievement or milestone, which is called the false belief task. This is a task that is designed to measure kids' ability to understand that other people may see the world differently from how they see it, and that other people's actions, goals, and feelings will therefore depend on the other person's perspective. So just to give you a sense of this task, I'll show you a 5-year-old going through a version of a false belief task. Okay, so that's called passing a false belief task, and that's what 5-year-olds typically do. So you can see that he is able to correctly predict that Ivan will take Joshua's sandwich because he thinks that one is his, but it goes way beyond the action prediction. He also has an understanding of the unfolding narrative drama. He stops me to tell me about the problem that's coming. And in this way, understanding of theory of mind in these capacities actually is related to a lot of other capacities. For example, there's a moral harm happening here and a narrative function. And so people got very interested in this capacity, the developing capacity to solve false belief tasks, and part not just because of the success of 5-year-olds, but by contrast, the failures of 3-year-olds. So just to give you a quick sense of that, here's what happens if you ask the same question to an equally attentive 3-year-old. Okay, so that's failing a false belief task. And what caught people's attention when this task was first invented in the early 80s is that, of course, there's many things that 5-year-olds are better at than 3-year-olds, pretty much everything. What's interesting about the 3-year-old performance is that they're not uncertain, they're not at chance, they're 100% wrong and just as confident. So if you teach, for example, a 3-year-old to bet, 3-year-olds will bet all of their counters on the wrong answer. They're sure that if Ivan says he wants his cheese sandwich, he will take his cheese sandwich. And you don't have to do this in a predictive context. If you show them which sandwich Ivan is taking and ask them to explain it, this is kind of typical behavior that they come up with some other reason why he might not want his sandwich anymore, like it's fallen on the grass. So this false belief task drew a lot of attention starting in the early 80s, in part because of this developmental transition from 100% failure at age 3 to success at age 5. This was tested and found to be similar across a huge range of cultures, not just developed societies, but also hunter-gatherer societies where there's a similar transition at a similar age. And then I think the reason why it in particular attracted so much attention was because of the exception to that rule, which is that children with autism spectrum disorders are selectively and disproportionately delayed at this kind of task compared to tasks of matched logical and linguistic complexity because of the need to think about somebody else's mental state. And that's a theme that I'll come back to throughout the talk. So the fact that a neurodevelopmental disorder, autism spectrum disorder, disproportionately impaired kids' capacity to do theory of mind tasks led to this hypothesis that maybe theory of mind was supported by a distinctive brain system. And that hypothesis was around for a long time before there were tools available to test it, which I'll go on to now. But I just realized that I forgot to say that I will take questions on anything at any time. So if you want to ask questions through the background or any part of my research, please go ahead. Okay, so the next thing we need is a tool that would let us test the neural basis of an abstract cognitive function in live human beings. And so therefore something that doesn't require drilling holes in the head, which we're not permitted to do with undergraduates or children. And so the neuroscience of theory of mind really took off with the invention of a huge suite of non-invasive neuroimaging technologies about 15 years ago. And the tool my lab mainly uses is functional MRI. So that's the MRI machine we have in the basement, and me going into the scanner to have my brain scanned. And the idea initially of this research when we started it 15 years ago was to characterize what brain regions are kids using when they solve problems like the pirate problem I just showed you. And in particular, what brain regions or what neural mechanisms do you need to solve theory of mind problems over and above the language and executive function and logical complexity of those problems? We started working not in children, but in a population we call typical human adults. They're MIT undergraduates. Since then, we've studied a much broader range of human beings. And what we need is then an adult version of the pirate problem that I showed you before. So what we do is we have people lying in the scanner, reading short verbal narratives and answering questions about them. So they might see a story like this. The morning of the dance, Sarah placed her shoes under her dress. That afternoon, her sister borrowed the shoes and later put them under the bed. And then we can ask you either, where are the shoes really? Are they under the bed or under the dress? Or we can ask you, where does Sarah think the shoes are? Under the dress or under the bed? As this experiment goes on, after you've answered that one, you might read another story like this one. A volcano erupted on the island 3 months ago. Now it's just barren lava rock, but we have satellite photographs that show what the island looked like before the eruption. And then we can ask you either, what did the island look like before the eruption? Or rather, what does the island look like in the photographs? It's either barren lava rock or covered in vegetation. Or we can ask you, what does it look like now? And the idea is that the second story requires you to think about the same level of logical complexity, two realities, the current reality and the one in the photograph, to choose between them, to make a response. And what's different between them, or one of the things that's different between them, is that the first story is about people and their thoughts, whereas the second story is about physical objects and physical representations. Okay, so this keeps going, and this is the adult version of a false belief task. While we're doing this, of course, we're measuring blood oxygenation at every position in the brain of the subject in the scanner. And so what we're looking for is places in the brain where over the course of the experiment, the blood oxygenation ratio is going up more when the story you're reading is about somebody's mental states compared to when the story you're reading is not about mental states. And those will be candidate brain regions whose involvement in a theory of mind problem is specific to the need to think about mental states. And then the way that MRI data are often shown is by showing you over the whole brain, overlaying as a color map the statistics. So how statistically significant was the difference between those two conditions? And sometimes I'll show you the data that way. Okay, so we can think of this false belief task as having two kinds of stories. One's about belief and one's about photographs. And we're going to ask, over and above all the things you need to solve a false photograph task, are there any brain regions showing extra metabolism when the story is about somebody, a person, and their mental states? We were among the first groups to do this, but a number of groups did this kind of experiment all pretty much simultaneously in the early 2000s when neuroimaging became available for this kind of task. And remarkably, everybody got the same answer. This doesn't always happen in neuroimaging, but all the labs that tried this got the same answer. There's a group of brain regions that are more active when the story is about mental states. These include the right temporoparietal junction, which I will talk a lot about today, its left homologue, the left temporoparietal junction, and two regions along the midline, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate and precuneus. To give you a sense of what activity looks like in this task, here's the right temporoparietal junction and typical activity. This is the way I'll present a lot of the data in this talk. So the x-axis here is time. 0 is the time when we put the story on the screen. These stories are on the screen for 12 seconds. So after 12 seconds, the question comes on the screen and the person has a chance to answer that question. And then what we have on the y-axis is % signal change from rest. So 0 is that region's resting level of activity, and we're going to look at change from rest over time. If you do that, you see that when we put a story on the screen that has a belief in it, activity starts to go up right away. What that tells you is this is activity involved in understanding the story, not producing the answer, but understanding the story itself, thinking about the mental states in the story. And it lasts as long as the story is on the screen. If we put up a story that has no mental states in it, then characteristically we get no activity in this region, as if there were nothing on the screen at all. So that's a candidate brain region for having some kind of role in theory of mind. That's certainly not enough evidence, and I will show you a bunch of the evidence that led us, or at least a little bit of the evidence that led us to infer that this brain region's role is specifically in thinking about other people's mental states. But just a couple more points on methods. This activation is so reliable that we can see it in each individual person that we scan. So here's 3 sample individuals. This is representative data. Each person we scan, we can find all these regions in each individual. And so we use that as a tool to deal with the fact that people's brains are unique. They're about as unique as faces. So everybody's brains have the same general parts, but the parts are in slightly different places. And so to know that we're studying the same part in each individual, we use individual subject regions of interest, which means we first find these brain regions in each individual and then study that brain region in our subsequent experiments. So we'll then extract the response in that brain region for each individual in the next experiments. We have a technique for doing this, a tool that we've developed that takes less than 10 minutes of the time the participant is in the scanner, and works in about 90% of individuals. And we now make this tool freely available on our website. It's been used in over 15 countries in many different languages. We've just done it for the first time in sign language, which we're very excited about. So this is a very general tool that will let you identify these specific brain regions, and then you can use them for future study. Okay, so that is our research strategy. And now I'm going to put together those pieces. So a neuroimaging tool that lets us find and study brain regions involved in thinking about mental states, and this history of interest in theory of mind as a specific human cognitive capacity. And I'm going to go on to tell you about 3 lines of recent research that we've done in the lab. Okay, so the first is a small sample of the research that leads us to believe these brain regions really are specifically involved in theory of mind. So it's going to be 4 experiments in typically developing adults, showing that we know what drives this brain region and that it's specifically thinking about other people's thoughts. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about adults with autism, so to understand how typical development so basically alternatives to typical development, the development of high-functioning adults with autism spectrum disorders, and what might underlie social difficulties in that population. And then I'll get to the most recent part of our research, which is, again, new stuff, hot off the presses, presenting it for the first time today, looking at children, both typically developing children and children with autism. That's the plan, and starting with typically developing adults. And to do this, the first experiment I'm going to do is going to be participatory to help everybody wake up before lunch. So in this part of, so I'm going to get you guys to participate in the way we did this original experiment. This experiment involves 144 stories that people read in the scanner, and then we characterize those stories on a number of different dimensions outside the scanner, and you guys are going to do 2 of those dimensions. So this side of the room, as I read you each story, what I want you to do is rate for that story how much physical pain the character in the story is experiencing, pain of the body. And I want you to use your hand for that rating. So the more the character in the story is experiencing pain, the higher your hand. Does that instruction make sense? Okay, and you guys are going to judge how much are you thinking about the thoughts of the character in the story, the character's hopes, beliefs, doubts, suspicions. The more you're thinking about their thoughts, the higher your hand. Is that clear? Okay, so we'll start with the first story. So Larry was going to his first day of a new job. The job starts very early, so Larry was extremely tired. He made himself fresh juice and took a big drink. The juice was cool, and he felt the tang of it on the soft tissue inside his mouth. Great. Oscar was doing the dishes after dinner. He was talking with his friends while his hands were in the soapy water. Then his hand hit a sharp knife. The knife cut deep into the skin between his fingers, and the cut burned in the dirty water. Okay? Maggie's in love with a man and wishes that he would reciprocate her feelings. One day, this man sends a text to Maggie he meant to send to someone else, saying he does not want to see her again. Maggie gets the text and starts crying. Excellent. Okay, so you guys get the sense of these stories. Each story is unique. Different things happen to the characters in them, and we can characterize them along a lot of dimensions, including the 2 that you guys rated here, and many others. We characterize them on 33 dimensions, including linguistic complexity and logical complexity, and also various properties of the character, whether they deserved what happened to them, and so forth. And I'll just show you a little bit of those results, starting with in this brain region, the right temporoparietal junction. So the first thing we can ask is the question you guys answered, that is, how much physical pain is the character in the story experiencing? So the way I'm going to show you these data is every dot is going to be a story. On the x-axis, we have how much that story described a character in physical pain. So just like the rating that you guys gave, we got this from a bunch of people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk who read the stories and told us how much is the character in physical pain. On the y-axis, I'm going to show you activity in the right TPJ to the same story in a different group of people. So now there's a group of people in the scanner reading these stories, and we're going to ask, does one group of people's rating of physical pain predict another group of people's activity in the scanner? Okay, so in the right TPJ, it's certainly not the case that being more in physical pain leads to more activity. If anything, it's the other way around, that the set of stories that describe the most physical pain get very little activity in the right TPJ. And in fact, if you ask where in the brain is there activity that's predicted by the amount of physical pain the character is experiencing, it's in a group of brain regions associated actually with the first-person experience of physical pain. So brain regions like middle cingulate and secondary sensory cortex that would be responsive if you experienced pain. When you're reading a story about a third person experiencing the pain, those brain regions show activity, but not, for example, the right TPJ. Another question we asked is just about how engaging the stories were themselves, how vivid and movie-like was that story. This also has variability across our stories, but it's not related to activity in the right TPJ. And the brain region actually that is related to this is in the thalamus, which I think is totally interesting. But getting to the question that I asked you guys, so now this is the question, does the story make you think about thoughts, beliefs, etc. of the character? So this is the one dimension that actually does explain variance. So when you measure, did you think that story described thoughts, beliefs, doubts of a character? If so, that story activated another person's right TPJ more. And overall, that measurement lets us explain 20% of the variance across items in the response of the right TPJ. Just again, to reiterate, if you look at these brain regions, the ones that are predicted by the answer to this question, does it make you think about thoughts of a character? That's the set of brain regions I showed you before, right and left TPJ, the medial prefrontal cortex and precuneus. And interestingly, those are actually completely non-overlapping from the brain regions that respond to physical pain, as if our representation of other people was really divided between our representation of their mind and of their body. Okay, so that's a little bit of evidence that this brain region is involved in thinking about thoughts, as opposed to other things about people, like physical states. Another way that we tried to study that in another experiment is by asking not about variability between stories, so what makes one story different from another, but by looking within the same story as you change what information you're giving, can we predict when these brain regions will be involved? So in this experiment, we presented information in successive chunks. So for example, here's a story. Erica lives in Los Angeles. One night recently, she was in a bar where a fight broke out between two drunk men, and she was caught in between. In spite of her neighborhood, Erica has a strong dislike of violence and believes conflicts can usually be resolved without fists. And then the story goes on, and we ask you how Erica feels. The key manipulation here is that because the story is unfolding over time, we can manipulate when in time we tell you about what she thinks about the situation that she's in, even though the story continues to be about the same character. And so we have stories where for 6 seconds you're reading about a character's background, where she comes from, her social relationships, but not her mental states. And then we give you the mental state. So again, here's activity in the right TPJ when the mental state information is available immediately, as soon as we put the story on the screen. Here's activity when we delay the information about mental states for 6 seconds in the story, and that's 6 seconds. Okay, so that says that this brain region is actually pretty easy to control in the sense that its activity comes and goes with the need to think about somebody else's mental state. So that's a little bit of evidence, but a stronger piece of evidence that would let us know that we're really studying something related to theory of mind would be to show that the neural activity is the basis of the kinds of judgments we make, that it's not just on or off, but that it's actually correlated with performance in this cognitive capacity. So that's the next thing I'm going to show you. But in order to get variability in performance that we could then explain, so to have adults vary in their performance on these tasks, we need to go beyond false belief tasks. False belief tasks are too easy for adults. There's one right answer. Everybody gets that right answer. And so if we want to study really how these brain regions support this function, we need a task that's a little bit harder for our population. So to do that, we moved on to a new task, which is moral judgments. And here again, you guys are going to participate. So I'm going to give you an example of scenarios from our experiment, and I want you to make a moral judgment of the central character. And the way you're going to do that is I'm going to ask you how much moral blame does this character deserve for what they do, and the more moral blame the character deserves, the higher your hand. Is that clear? Okay, so this is a story about Grace, who's taking a tour of a chemical factory. And while she's on the tour of the factory, there's a break for coffee. And Grace goes to make coffee, and her friend says, could you get me a cup of coffee too? So Grace goes to make a cup of coffee for her friend. Now next to the coffee machine is a jar of white powder that is a dangerous toxic poison from the chemical factory. And it's labeled dangerous toxic poison. So Grace thinks that this is a dangerous poison that would be deadly when ingested. And she puts some of the powder in her friend's coffee and gives her friend the coffee, who drinks the coffee and dies. How much moral blame does Grace deserve for putting the powder in the coffee? Good, okay. You're all more or less safe to drink coffee with. Now how about, here's an alternative version of that scenario. Grace is taking a tour of a chemical factory. She stops to make coffee for her friend. Next to the coffee machine is a jar of white powder labeled sugar, which, unbeknownst to Grace, has been contaminated with a dangerous toxic poison. But Grace thinks that the powder is sugar, and she puts some in her friend's coffee. Her friend drinks the coffee and dies. How much blame does Grace deserve for putting the powder in the coffee? Okay, so that's good. You guys are making normal moral judgments. And what's critical here is that although nothing was different in the outside world, nothing is different in what happened in both of those scenarios is the same, that somebody drank a poisoned cup of coffee and died. For human judgment, it makes a huge difference to the moral blame that we give, whether the person intended the harm or not. So we've done this experiment where we have all 4 possible versions, whether she thought it was poison or not, and whether it was poison or not. And what you can see is that typical moral judgments depend almost entirely on what you thought. So we judge when you thought it was poison, it's basically entirely wrong. If you thought it was sugar in a justified way in this case, it's almost entirely forgivable. And the effect of what happened, whether the person died or not, is very small relative to the effect of what the person intended. Okay, so that makes for a task where we know that people will rely on beliefs to do the task, but there's also actually variability, both across items and across people, in how much the belief outweighs the outcome in moral judgment. And that actually happened in the room. I don't know if you noticed that everybody says intentional harms are all the way wrong, but there's some disagreement in exactly how okay the accidental harm was. And we see that in our experiment as well. So we can leverage that to try to study how the neural system is supporting these judgments. The first thing you might ask is the difference between these 2 scenarios more or less activity? That is, one of them drives more activity in these brain regions. And that is not the case, actually. So all of the brain regions in this group, but in particular the right TPJ, show equal, high, but equal activity, whether you're thinking about accidents or intentional harms. And to some extent, that makes sense. Both of those judgments depend on thinking about the character's intention. We blame you for intending the harm. We forgive you if you didn't intend the harm. But both of those rely on thinking about intentions. And so what we're doing now with a lot of the research in our lab is going beyond this kind of traditional fMRI approach of thinking on or off, how much, how little, to thinking about what information is actually encoded in those neural patterns. And so instead of looking at the overall amount of activity, what we're going to look for is within a brain region, the pattern of activity. And the idea here is that inside a brain region, when you study with fMRI, you're studying hundreds of thousands of neurons all at once. Inside that brain region are many distinct neural populations that are computing different information for the purposes of your task. And so if you have slightly different subpopulations inside a brain region, for example, that tell you whether the harm was intended or accidental, then you might be able to measure slightly different spatial patterns in terms of where the activity is within that brain region for intentional versus accidental harms. And that might tell you that that information is encoded in that brain region. So that's the strategy. I'll walk you through exactly how we do this. So you're reading this story, and at the time you get to the sentence that tells you the information. So for example, here you get to the sentence that says the container is labeled toxic for Grace, so Grace believes the white powder is a toxic substance. Or similarly, the sentence that says the container is labeled sugar, so Grace believes the powder is regular sugar. We're going to measure the pattern of activity at exactly that sentence. A key thing that I need to explain about this is that so there's 75 different scenarios in which harm happens accidentally or on purpose, and each of these scenarios is different, right? So this is one about poison, there's another one about an allergy to peanuts, there's many different ways across these scenarios, there's one about a broken parachute, so each scenario has a different way in which you could accidentally or on purpose harm somebody. And the idea is that two scenarios that differ in every other respect might have this feature in common of being both accidental or intentional harm. So we can measure within the brain region the neural pattern associated with one story about intentional or accidental harm. Again, measure the pattern of activity in the next story that has accidental or intentional harm. And once we've built up this pattern, the test will be when we get a new story, if we see just the pattern of neural activity, can we use that pattern to say, was this person reading about an intentional or an accidental harm, by asking this pattern, which of the two template patterns is it more similar to? Is it similar to the patterns from the stories that were accidental, or similar to the patterns of the stories that were intentional? Does that logic make sense? And if it is, then that will tell us that in the pattern of activity, there's information about this feature of whether the harm was committed accidentally or intentionally. Okay, so that's multivoxel pattern analysis, which we, among many other neuroimaging groups, are using to study what information is represented in a brain region. The first time we did this, so we did so I'm going to show you these data again. The thing I'm going to show you here is the correlation from new data to the stories that match it on the feature. So that is the stories that, the new story is from an accidental harm, the correlation between the pattern of activity for the stories that match it, that's the within condition correlation, and the stories that are different in every other respect and different in that feature, that's the across condition correlation. The idea here is that if the within condition correlation is higher than the across condition correlation, then there's pattern information present. Okay, so we did that first in one experiment with 23 subjects and found that indeed the correlation is higher for the stories that are within condition than across condition. That was a significant difference, but a small one. And a first instinct, if you see a small but significant difference, should always be to replicate it, see if it's true in another data set. We happen to have two other data sets in the lab run many years before in which we manipulated accidental versus intentional harm, in each case in a slightly different way. So always using the stimuli in a different way, slightly different words and slightly different tasks. So we went back to those data and found that hidden in our old data was the same pattern both in one previous experiment and in another previous experiment. So that makes us quite confident that there is pattern information inside the right TPJ that tells you whether harm is accidental or intentional. And then here's the key thing. Now we can relate this to behavior, because as I said, there's variability across people. So I'm going to show you behavioral variability on the x-axis. This is going to be how much worse does a person think intentional harm is than accidental harm. Again, everybody agrees it's somewhat worse, so the difference is always positive. Nobody thinks accidents are worse than intentional harms. But some people think accidents are entirely mitigating, so intentional harms are much worse than accidental harms. They'll be on this end of the axis. And some people are more mixed about it, think that accidents are somewhat bad, closer to intentional harms. They'll be towards this side of the axis. Okay, so that's their behavior. And then for each individual, we can ask how much pattern information is there in their right TPJ while they're reading these stories that would tell you the difference between accidental or intentional harm. And again, people higher up in this graph show a bigger difference in their right TPJ between the pattern of activity for intentional harms compared to accidental harms. Okay, so now each dot here is a person, and you can see that across people we can capture quite a bit of the variability in their moral judgments by measuring the variability in the pattern information in just this one brain region, the right temporoparietal junction. Okay, so that tells you that variability in representing the mental states in this brain region is related to variability in the moral judgments that you make based on those mental states. And in this case, unlike some of the other data I've shown you, that's specific to the right TPJ. So if we look in other brain regions involved in social cognition, there's actually no pattern information about accidental versus intentional harm in any of the other brain regions. It's quite particular to this one brain region. Okay, so that's correlational evidence that the representation or the pattern of information in this one brain region contains information about a key fact about your mental state, whether you knew what you were doing or didn't when you caused harm, and that that information is used in subsequent moral judgments. And knowing that lets us do our fourth experiment, in which we test whether this information is not just correlationally related to the moral judgments, but actually causally related. Okay? Because here the prediction is, if we're right, that the information in the right TPJ is what you're using to make your moral judgments in these cases, or in particular, to use the mental state information to make moral judgments, then if we could interfere with that information, if we could somewhat decrease the function of the right TPJ, we ought to be able to change your moral judgments, right? That's a strong prediction of this idea. Okay, so that means that we need to be able to use a tool that interferes with function of the right temporoparietal junction safely, ethically, and reversibly, because we're doing this in typical human adults. And so the tool that we use is transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is a tool that lets us pass a very strong but very brief magnetic field through the skull into the cortex just below the skull and temporarily create a burst of disorganized firing that disorganizes the normal activity in that brain region. And to give you a sense of it, here's a movie about TMS. That's the coil, that's a quarter, just to show you that it's a magnet. So when it turns on, flings the quarter away. Now we're going to do that on the part of my brain that controls my right hand. So when it goes off, it will make the neurons in that area fire. Okay, so obviously by the time it gets all the way through the skull, it's very muted, but there's still a small but significant effect of causing the neurons in the motor cortex to fire, which causes the involuntary contraction of my hand. And then for this experiment, we're going to move that TMS over to the right temporoparietal junction or a control region, both identified with fMRI. And that will let us test whether the right TPJ in particular needs to be functioning typically for typical moral judgments. Now, there's two ways to do TMS, and they have different advantages and disadvantages. One way is you do all the TMS first, 1 pulse a second for 20 minutes. So you're sitting there doing nothing, getting 1 pulse a second for 20 minutes. And that causes a sort of long, slow downregulation of this brain region that will stay downregulated for about 12 minutes after you finish pulsing. So you finish pulsing, now you're not getting TMS, you turn around and do all of our moral judgments for the next 10 minutes until the effects of TMS wear off. So that's one way. That means while you're doing the task, you're not having TMS, which can be an irritant or a distractor. The other way to do it is to do the TMS right during the task. So you're reading a story about what's going on, the powder and the poison and everything else. Right after you read the action that she puts the powder in her friend's coffee, at that moment we give you a quick burst of TMS and force you to make a speeded moral judgment. The advantage of that is that the TMS is happening exactly at the time that we predict that you need that information to make your moral judgment. Okay, so we did the experiment both ways. You get the same answer both ways. So I'm going to collapse across it. These are the moral judgments that people made when TMS was not on the right TPJ. It was on the control region just behind the right TPJ. Of course, nobody knows where their right TPJ is, so they don't know when they're having control TMS versus experimental TMS. And you see that these people are making essentially the same moral judgments that you made, distinguishing very strongly between the cases where she believed it was poison and the cases she believed it was sugar. When we put TMS over the right TPJ, by contrast, that difference gets smaller. So you both are more forgiving of failed attempts when you thought it was poison but it wasn't, and more punitive or blaming towards accidents where you thought it was sugar but it was poison. Okay, so the overall effect is an interaction between what she thought and the site of TMS on your moral judgments. Yeah, Justin. Not in this experiment. Yeah, so I believe that there is no subjective experience associated with this experiment, that it doesn't feel like anything. That's from our debriefing and consistent with what happens in TMS of higher level cognitive function. So my mental image of what this is like is that moral judgments typically rely on many different factors about the story. And that's true in these scenarios. They differ in many ways. They differ in what you believed and how you came to believe it, but also how bad the harm was that you caused and whether you were potentially in any danger in the situation and what your prior relationship was to the person that you harmed. And so typically, a moral judgment is a summary representation over many relevant factors, and you have to weigh all of them. And the way what I picture what we did in this experiment is that we made one source of information less salient or less reliable. And so when that summary computation is done over all the different factors, that one gets weighed less. But since there's always many factors, some of which are relevant and some of which are not, it doesn't feel like anything different to make a moral judgment in which the belief seems less relevant than, for example, the prior relationship or the amount of harm. That's what all moral judgments feel like. You're always trading off these factors. And so subjects, and the other thing is they're using a 7-point scale, and there's 7 points of variability in these stories. So the difference we're making is not shifting you from no to yes, but shifting you from a 5 to a 4. And so that doesn't particularly jump out at you as, wow, I'm making a moral judgment I wouldn't normally make. It feels like the regular variability, and what we've done is just bias that variability in one direction. Good, thanks. Okay. All right, so that's part one. That's a tiny bit of the research I did traditionally looking in typical adults at neural mechanisms for theory of mind. And again, that is a whole research program, but I'm going to stop with typical adults now and move on to kids and people with autism, because I think that might be more specifically relevant to you guys. Okay, so a little bit about the neural basis of theory of mind in high-functioning adults with autism spectrum disorder. As I said at the beginning, one of the primary impeti for research in theory of mind was the observation that children with autism spectrum disorders were selectively and disproportionately impaired on tasks that required them to think about mental states. And so all along through studying this neural mechanism that supports theory of mind in typically developing adults, the question has always been, okay, have we found the brain regions that are the site of the impairment that's responsible for autism? That was what we went out to look for in some sense initially. And so you might ask, okay, well, have we found the source of problems on false belief tasks in autism? But a subtlety to that is that high-functioning adults with autism actually don't fail false belief tasks. If you give false belief tasks to high-functioning adults with autism, they pass it as well as typical adults do, and with the same speed, which we've shown in our data as well. Now, there was a long-standing hypothesis, which I shared, that the reason why these adults were passing the false belief tasks, in spite of real persistent social difficulties in the real world, is because the laboratory tasks lend themselves to compensatory mechanisms. And so they weren't truly tapping social reasoning, that people with autism could solve false belief tasks using logical reasoning that didn't require social cognition at all. And that was the hypothesis that we had going into this research. And if so, the neuroscience lets you directly test that hypothesis because we know what the typical neural mechanisms are for solving false belief tasks. We also know how typical adults solve other logical problems like the false photograph tasks. And so we could ask, is there any reason to believe that high-functioning adults with autism approach false belief tasks the way we approach hard logical reasoning tasks that aren't about social reasoning? Okay, so that was the hypothesis of compensation. And we set out to test that actually starting a long time ago. Eventually, we built up 2 matched groups of individuals, matched in age and IQ and gender, each containing 27 individuals who did the false belief task in the scanner, as I showed it to you before. And so now what I'm going to show you is in red, the pattern of activity for the adults with autism, and in blue, the pattern of activity in the matched, typically developing adults, looking specifically at the false belief stories. And they are identical. There's no differences anywhere in the activation that the individuals with autism had. This is, of course, worrying. I mean, for many reasons. I obviously have a financial incentive in thinking that this research is relevant, but also a scientific incentive of wanting to know, well, why then are there these social difficulties? And it took us a long time to get confident that this null result was really real. Because if you see a null result, 2 groups are not different. You want to know, did you really have the power to see differences if they existed? And so what we want to know is actually not, are these 2 groups that we happen to measure different from one another, but are the individuals with autism really within the typical distribution that we would see of typically developing individuals? So to test that hypothesis, we went back and aggregated all the data we had ever collected in the lab on the false belief task. That gave us a population of 462 typically developing individuals, which I believe is the largest fMRI data set so far ever collected on anything that I know of. And that could give us a way of getting what is actually the typical distribution of activity in this task in the typical population. And if so, can we find out whether people with autism fall within that typical distribution? To give you a sense of one of our measures, this is the magnitude of activation in one region, the right TPJ. So the x-axis here is the magnitude of activation in that region, and it's a histogram. So the y-axis is number of participants. And you can see a not quite normal, but round distribution where most people have activation, mean activation between 3.5 and 4.5. This is t-values, but there's a long tail. So if what was going on was something like reduced activation in people with autism, you would expect individuals with autism to be clustered on the lower end of this scale. So now I'll show you one dot for each individual with autism that we tested, and you can see that these are basically exactly the same distribution. And that's true not only in the right TPJ, but also in the medial prefrontal cortex, and indeed everywhere we looked. Okay, so now with a very large sample, we are confident that the original hypothesis that adults with autism don't use these brain regions when reasoning about false beliefs is wrong. That's not what's going on. And so that made us move on to a second hypothesis, which is that it's not the gross organization, the presence or absence or magnitude of activation in these brain regions that might be affected in autism. But that maybe what we should be looking for is subtler deficits in the organization within a region, and in particular, in tasks where there are impairments. Remember, in the false belief task, these adults with autism don't look any different from typical participants in their behavior. And so we went to look for a task where we would find differences in behavior. And here again, we relied on the moral judgments task. So this is now moral judgments data from age and IQ matched individuals to the individuals with autism, again showing that the dominant factor in moral judgments in this population is the belief. And what we found is that the role of beliefs in moral judgment is significantly smaller, even in these high-functioning adults with autism who perform perfectly on false belief tasks. The way we think about this is the false belief task has a right and a wrong answer, and that's a scaffold. But these moral judgments, as I was explaining to Justin before, have a spectrum. And when there's a spectrum, there's more flexibility for the weight that you give to different factors. And when we create that flexibility, then the deficit in reasoning about other people's mental states, or at least the difference, reemerges in the same population. Okay, so that again gives us a straightforward hypothesis. We know that the information that adults use to help them make the distinction between intentional and accidental harm is represented in the pattern of information inside the right temporoparietal junction. This is the data I showed you before. So if that information is central to the distinction between intentional and accidental harm, and that distinction is less salient for individuals with autism, you might expect this pattern of information to not be present in individuals with autism, and indeed it isn't. So there's no pattern distinction between intentional and accidental harm in the people with autism who are making these moral judgments, consistent with the lack of such a distinction in their behavior. Okay, so for adults, we think that's evidence that the way we should think about the neural source of the deficits in behavior is not as gross anatomy, not large-scale deviations, but rather as differences in the more subtle structure of the representation within the brain regions involved in these tasks. But autism is primarily a developmental disorder, right? It has a trajectory over time. And so the next focus that we wanted to get to is not just what's the end state of atypical development, but more about the process by studying children with autism themselves, and also by studying typical development. So I'm now going to move on to, again, this is all brand new data, looking at how do these brain regions become what we have seen in adults? How do they develop both in the course of a typical child's life, and then how are they affected in autism? Okay, but starting with typical development.
Can I interrupt you just for a second?
Of course.
So with the adults, basically, then your outcome is that adults with ASD are focused on the outcome, and so the outcome is that if that outcome is fine, not so much about the moral at all. So that's the sort of innovation pattern that you're seeing there, is that you're not making moral judgments. This is the outcome.
I don't think I would say that they're not making moral judgments. But I think they are making moral judgments. And this again, I think that using an intention is just one part of making moral judgments. So people with autism are very sensitive to many other aspects of moral judgment. And actually, this has been both a big finding and a big controversy in the literature about autism, that a key distinction that people have focused on before is the distinction between moral judgments and conventional judgments, right? So what a lot of the literature on moral development has focused on is knowing the difference between things that are wrong just because of our local conventions or rules, like wearing pajamas to give a job talk, and things that are wrong because they harm somebody or violate a moral rule. So there was a hypothesis a long time ago that maybe people with autism wouldn't be as sensitive to that distinction, and that is not true. There's extensive evidence that both in childhood and in adulthood, people with autism are very sensitive to the distinction between conventional and moral harms, and know that conventional harms are authority dependent, whereas moral harms are not, for example, just as typical children do. And the conclusion of that is that there's no impairment of moral judgment in autism. I think what our research shows is that that's a limited view of morality and of moral judgment, and that there are other aspects of moral judgment that do depend on reasoning about mental states, and then those do show differences both in adults and in children, as I'll show you. Great. Yeah?
A lot of the kids with autism have difficulty with social situations in which they are required to live with someone. So this is being fed through the auditory process, obviously, and not the visual process. Have you looked at that aspect?
I have. So actually, up until now, everything I've shown you is visual, but it's all reading, it's all verbal, and it is offline and hypothetical. And so one of the things to see clearly here is that these tasks don't require the fast, online, dynamic aspects of social cognition. A second hypothesis that I didn't put here, so a hypothesis we had when we saw that false belief task performance looked typical in adults with autism. So I've shown you one, which is that it's about subtler disorganization of features. Another hypothesis we had was that offline reasoning of hypothetical dilemmas didn't elicit any deficit at all, because actually, once you take off the pressure and the ambiguity of dyadic interaction and the individual right there in front of you, then maybe there's no social deficit left at all. So we did an entire line of research getting people in face-to-face dialogue in the scanner. So managing to make it feel like you're right now face-to-face online. This is not trivial because you're lying on your back in a tube, right? But to make you feel like by doing it with camera loops and so on, that you're face-to-face with somebody and forcing you to engage with them. And there we did see differences in the neural signature in adults in separate data that I don't have here. But the next thing that I'll show you is that these offline dilemmas, well, as indeed in the adults, also in the children, offline dilemmas that rely on reasoning about other people still do show really substantial deficits in both children and adults with autism if you get the task right. Okay, thanks. Okay, so typical development, and actually that's a great segue, because we're going to study kids in the school age. So these are kids from kindergarten to 5th grade. And we're studying them for a number of reasons. One is that they are possible to study with fMRI. So that's a limiting factor, that although we have tried to explain what we mean by lie completely still to 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, it has been hard to communicate what that means. So mostly for the purposes of our current MRI research, we're able to study kids once we can explain to them what an MRI experiment involves. And that's starting in kindergarten, so about age 4. And when we originally set out to do this research, to study theory of mind development from kindergarten through 5th grade, the state of the literature suggested that there was essentially no point. That because kids passed the false belief task by age 5, the theory of mind development was done. They had become adults from their theory of mind perspective. But of course, I think both common sense and clinical intuition suggest that there's a lot to develop in your thinking about other people that you need to do after age 5, and that the limit was in the existing tools for measuring theory of mind. That if we measure only false belief performance, of course, we'll get a limited window into the developing capacity. And so the first thing that we needed was a tool that would be a more sensitive measure of kids' ability to reason about other people's thoughts, feelings, and goals that would be relevant to children from kindergarten through 5th grade. So we developed a task that we call the Theory of Mind Booklets task, not a very creative name, which is an interactive storybook activity in which as the story unfolds, this is a story about children in a classroom making decisions about what books to read at reading time. And as the story unfolds, there's a series of little puzzles, 44 different questions that tap different aspects of understanding of other people's goals, desires, feelings, etc., including some higher level concepts like expectations, interpretations, non-literal references, and moral judgments based on mental states. To give you a sense of what this looks like, I'm going to show you a short video of a couple of kids. The first thing you're going to see is one of the warm-up trials where they learn how these booklets work. So they're helping the kids find the book they want for reading time, and the books are attached by magnets into our little task, and so they can actually pick up the book off the page and give it to the child who wanted it, which is a tool to help keep the kids engaged as we're asking them 44 questions over the course of 40 minutes in these booklets. So you'll first see a warm-up trial, and then you'll see 2 of the more difficult trials. Okay, so that gives you a sense of how this task goes. Just to clarify, the second one got it wrong. The third one was right. That was, I hope, clear. So he expected mountains, and the second kid got the Chloe story right. Okay, so this is a series of hard problems in reasoning about what other people are going to think and feel. So as I said, there's 44 questions. We code both which answer they choose and the explanations that they give. So that explanation that child gave, that the reason they chose the broom is that the hat looks like a sailboat, that is a completely correct answer. And they get a score for that. On the other hand, the child who says she thinks it's plants in there doesn't get scored for a correct explanation. Okay. This task, which we've now studied in a few hundred kids, has substantial variability over the age range that we're interested in. So each dot here is a child's score on this task, where age is on the x-axis and performance is on the y-axis. So you can see that in the age range we're interested in, we are measuring variability in kids' performance. It's not like theory of mind development is all done at this age range. We can also pick up on a very significant but heterogeneous deficit in children with autism. So among the kids with autism that we've measured, as you can see, the average of that group is much below their age-matched peers, although some of the kids with autism are performing equal to their age-matched peers. This difference goes over and above differences in language, IQ, or vocabulary. So vocabulary, grammar, and IQ. Yeah?
Can you just very quickly tell us what's the normal diagnostics for the ASD kids in here? Nothing to do with the diagnostics.
So these kids are diagnosed with autism both by a clinician and by the typical tool for scientific research, which is the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, the ADOS. That is a whole routine you engage in, which involves face-to-face games and pretend play and conversation and assessing repetitive behaviors in a conversation. They don't use hypothetical dilemmas exactly like this. Yeah. Having said that, there's a bunch of uncertainty in diagnostic practice for all psychiatric diseases, and presumably a bunch of heterogeneity in who gets labeled as having, I mean, not just presumably, there's very strong evidence that diagnostic practices are heterogeneous. And as a consequence, the children who are all going to share the label of autism have been diagnosed with a heterogeneous process, depending on cohort effects, also where in the country they were diagnosed, and clinician differences. There are big site differences in exactly how diagnosis is done. And so although there is probably massive heterogeneity in the autistic population to begin with, I'm sure it's being superimposed by heterogeneity in diagnosis, and we can't sort that back out again. We treat as autistic the people who are diagnosed as autistic. That's a big problem for gold standard research in this area. Yeah. Okay, so our tool is picking up on both variability in typical individuals, change over time, and differences across populations. However, it does have stable individual differences, so these differences across individuals. This is from data from 29 kids who were retested again 2 years later on a slightly more advanced version of our booklet. You can see there's a lot of shared variability from across the 2 visits, and this variability is specific to theory of mind. So after we account for variability related to grammar, vocabulary, and IQ, only theory of mind scores at visit 1 predict theory of mind scores at visit 2. So there's significant individual differences, and they are specific to theory of mind, as measured by our booklets. So that suggests that we can measure variability in the behavior of theory of mind in the age range that we're going to study. And now the question is, okay, that theory of mind development, is it related to anything in the neural mechanisms that we've been studying in adults? To test that question, we need a tool that will let us study theory of mind in the brain in children. So again, we're going to use our MRI, but it's kitted out a little differently when we have children come to visit. We have to make the task fun and engaging. Of course, we want the kids to experience this as a scientific outreach experience, not just as a service. And we think we're doing a pretty good job. Over the last 5 years, we've learned how to scan kids to keep them engaged. This was after a visit, a 4-year-old made us a Lego scanner. I don't know if you can see that it has a control panel with the scientist at it, a participant lying on the bed being slid into the scanner, which is a circle. So anyway, the kids are getting something out of their experience. What we ask them to do while they're in the scanner, again, all of the experiments we did with adults are based on reading, but we can't ask little kids to read our stimuli. And so we present them the verbal narratives auditorily. They're going to listen to the stories and answer simple questions at the end of the story. To give you a sense of what this is like, I'm going to play you some of the stories that the children hear while they're lying in the scanner. So here's the first one.
When she turned 10, she discovered why her friends were disappearing. They were being taken to Garberville by a lonely and selfish fairy. She felt very mad and sad when she thought about her friends so far away from their families. She wanted to do something to help.
Okay, so that's in the mental condition, and then we have stories that don't have mental states.
In the tiny town of Chew and Swallow, it rained or snowed 3 times each day, once during breakfast, once during lunch, and once during dinner. But it never rained rain, and it never snowed snow. It rained things like soup and juice, and snowed things like mashed potatoes.
Okay, so stories about both kind of fantastical stories, but some involving people and their thoughts, some involving the physical world. In a group of control adults, these stories elicit the same group of brain regions I've been showing you before, the right and left temporoparietal junction, medial prefrontal cortex, and precuneus. And in children aged 5 to 12, we get the same brain regions again. Okay, so that means in these kids, we can identify these brain regions, but what we want to know is there any evidence of developmental change? Again, as I told you, the standard view was there couldn't be developmental change. They already passed false belief tests. But what we found is that there is some developmental change. And to understand it, you need to know what the other conditions were in this experiment. So one of them are stories that now are about people, but not about their mental states. So here's an example. Okay, so now we're going to look inside the right TPJ at response to these 3 kinds of stories. As I've shown you many times before now, in adults, the response is specific to stories that are about mental states, not other things about people. So stories about other things about people and the physical world both get low response. When we're looking at 8 to 12-year-olds, now stories about people have an intermediate response. So this is not just theory of mind, but really a broader social function. And in the youngest children that we studied in this experiment, the response was now almost entirely about people and the social world, not specific to mental states at all. So again, now reading it in the opposite direction, in the order of development, it looks like a brain region whose role is something more general in social reasoning is becoming more specialized for thinking about other people's thoughts over the course of the school years. And to test whether that's related to performance on the tasks that we developed, so now I will show you for each individual child, so each child is going to be a dot, how selective, that is, how much this brain region distinguishes between mental state information and other information about a person on the x-axis, and their performance on the Theory of Mind booklet's questions on the y-axis, and those are quite related. So kids who perform, and they're related even about, once we control for age. So kids who, for their age, perform relatively well on these booklet tasks have a relatively selective right TPJ. Okay. So that's typical development. And now quickly on the effects of autism spectrum. I want to make sure there's enough time for questions. So we wanted to know, again, whether this development of selectivity in these brain regions is affected in children of this age who have autism. A challenge with this is scanning children in general and kids with autism in particular. So just to give you a sense of how that goes, we recruited 145 kids over the course of 5 years to participate in this experiment, which takes 2 visits, including all of our behavioral tasks and the fMRI task. We lost 2 kids because we detected anatomical anomalies in their brains. 1 kid withdrew. 4 kids had procedural errors. 11 kids who were typically developing were rated by their parents as having social delays, and so were excluded. And 70 children had inadequate quality in their fMRI data. And so what we get left with is 54 kids who have usable data, of whom, in our fMRI sample, 18 have autism. And so after 5 years of recruiting 145 kids, we were going to end up with 36 kids in our study, 18 kids with autism, and 18 matched, typically developing kids who are matched for age, IQ, and their quality of their data in the scanner measured by motion, translation, and rotation. Yeah? So 2 of the children with autism, when we scanned them, were found to have, I think in both cases, cysts. So large, visible differences in the anatomical structure of their brain. It's not known whether that's causal of their autism or incidental, although it was in both cases kids with autism. But because we're trying to study, so strangely, this is the way the diagnostic procedure goes, you study social deficits caused by autism not explained away by other known factors. If we find that there's an other factor, like their brain has some large anomaly, then we don't treat them as part of the autism group. That's a judgment call, whether they were diagnosed with autism, they were autistic by behavioral measures, but the decision is that if some large-scale neurological anomaly could be explaining their behavior on the task, then we shouldn't lump them in with the kids who don't have that kind of anomaly. It's a judgment call. Yeah. Okay. It also makes their function of their brain harder to compare since the anatomy is different. So all the kids we're going to study have comparable anatomy. Okay, so we have 36 kids in our matched sample. We're actually going to use a 4th condition to try to get comparable activity because kids with autism have difficulties both in the social tasks and in language tasks. So we're going to use an even lower level control, which is music. So in the scanner, they just hear music. We use the contrast of mental versus music, so that's everything social and language compared to something that has nothing social and no language, so the biggest possible difference, to find brain regions involved in any of these processes. And those contrasts give us extremely similar patterns of activation in the kids with autism and the matched sample. So that gives us now a hypothesis space, a place to start to look for subtler differences inside those brain regions. Okay, so this is just the same data that I showed you in a different way. This is the right temporoparietal junction response over time. And you can see that in both groups, there's a robust response to the stories about mental states compared to the control condition, music. That's how we identify this brain region, although this is independent data. But critically, what we find is that when you look at the other 2 conditions, in the typically developing kids, as we saw before in the adults, this is a selective response to mental state information relative to any other information. And in kids with autism, it's less selective, both mental relative to the social response, but even actually relative to other language stimuli, stories that have no people in them at all. So this brain region, which in typical kids is really, by this age, about mental states, in kids with autism is doing a bunch of other functions. And that is related to performance on our Theory of Mind booklets. So again, this is selectivity of the right TPJ on the x-axis for typical kids and kids with autism, performance on our booklets on the y-axis. You can see that some kids with autism are normal on both measures, so performing normally on the booklets task and have a normal selectivity in the right TPJ. There are some kids, however, who are performing much worse on the booklets task, and those tend to be the kids with a much less selective right TPJ. This is not specific to the right TPJ. We also see much less selectivity in other brain regions, including in medial prefrontal cortex. Okay, so that suggests that unlike in adults, where the differences we saw were very subtle differences of pattern information within brain regions, in children we can see much bigger differences between typically developing kids and kids with autism in the development of selectivity of this brain region as a whole. So that's it for the data in this talk. I thought I'd just briefly mention some of the other ongoing projects in the lab. So one of the major projects I'm excited about is studying social development much earlier. So instead of studying it in school-age children, we're getting excited of studying it in pre-verbal kids using both MRI and NIRS in infants. I'm interested in not just the biological mechanisms underlying theory of mind, but also how environmental influences can change these neural mechanisms. One of the ways we're studying that is by studying deaf children of signing versus non-signing parents. So deaf children of non-signing parents have long delays in their exposure to language, which have effects on their theory of mind. And we're finding long-lasting effects on the neural mechanisms underlying theory of mind long after the language delay is made up. The main tradition of my research, which is in the basic neuroscience of theory of mind, we're expanding on the pattern analysis data I showed you, figuring out what features of mental states are represented and where they are represented. As a teaser, we find that a whole range of epistemic features of mental states are represented in the right TPJ, whereas affective features are represented in medial prefrontal cortex. And I'm interested in studying the application of theory of mind in the real world. This research in my lab has mostly focused on intergroup conflict and in how activities that engage theory of mind or perspective taking can be used as interventions to increase empathy and understanding across conflict groups. Okay, but to end just by going back to the bigger picture, I told you at the beginning that I think studying theory of mind has potential implications for education and for public health, which I think it does. On the other hand, I don't think this is application ready. I don't think any of the research that I presented here today is the kind of thing that could be applied in schools tomorrow. And so it's worth thinking about what's the bigger picture of the relationship between basic science and application. And here I think this is a very general message that on the one hand, many new ideas for application arise in basic science, so with patience and the long view, the things that we're discovering here under the hood of these mechanisms might be really important for the future generation of applications in health and education. But more importantly, I think that from the scientist perspective, what we stand to gain from encounters with people trying to apply our ideas is that a focus on application creates a focus on not just things that are significant, but things that are big effects, right? So tiny effects that you nail down exactly might not be the right thing to apply in the real world. And we get, I think basic science, we need to recognize, we get our raison d'etre, we get our buy-in, we get our source of investment from the public and from the broader community because of the potential for future intervention and future application. And keeping that in mind, I think, can help us keep grounded in the reason we got started in these problems in the first place. So with that, I will thank my lab, the agencies that funded this research, and you guys for your attention. Thank you. Darko. Thank you.
I had many questions, but probably the most interesting thing that I think you said was the idea about moral judgments from an integration from many different cues, right? So, two-part question really. So, thinking about children's moral development, from that perspective, the changes that children make in moral judgments would come perhaps from, they got this integrator and maybe the integrator is biased towards some things and not others, and that changes over time. Or maybe the integrator is not, biased at all, and some information is just more precise, and over time develops because more precise, and now the integrator can use that. And so I'm curious, both
that was a lot of different aspects of that question, and also you didn't have a mic, so I will try to rephrase bits of it as we go along. Okay, so I was saying earlier in response to Justin's question that I view moral judgment as having what you can think of as two stages. One is a representation of all the relevant features. So as you go along and you learn what was the relationship between this person and the person they harmed, also were they acting out of self-defense or under a delusion or in defense of their children, like all the factors that might change or mitigate your moral judgment, also how bad was the harm that they committed and what did they think they were doing, all of those factors. So that I think of as the encoding phase, where you're lining up all these relevant inputs. And then there's something like an integration phase where you have to weigh those inputs to come up with one thing, which is a judgment of blame or punishment or something like that. Okay, so we have a little bit of neural evidence that it's right to think of there being these two separate stages and that they operate at different times, for example, and that we can intervene on both of them we think, to some degree with TMS. And then the question that Darko asked first is, should we think of developmental change in kids' lives as developmental change in the first phase, so figuring out what all the relevant factors are and representing them precisely, or in the second phase, creating the right weighted average, for example, of those features and producing some outcome? Okay, so what I will say about that is, I think what's exciting there is that that's a cognitive science question to which neuroscience could contribute, because to the extent that we have the right neural markers for those different processes, we could tap that and answer that question. We haven't done that yet, in part because the signal that we're using to see when you're representing this information, the pattern analysis, requires pretty high quality data, and we didn't know if you could do it in kids. We didn't know if you could do that kind of pattern analysis in kids. There is, as of right now, no published study using pattern analysis in kid data in fMRI, and that could be because you need so much data to do that kind of analysis, and it's very hard to keep kids in the scanner for that long. I'm excited to say we've just collected a data set in kids in which we're trying to do pattern analysis. I think it is working. It's not on moral judgments, because when we were going to do it for the first time, we didn't know, well, we certainly didn't want kids in the scanner listening to 75 stories about somebody being killed. It is possible to do these same actions over stealing somebody's cupcake. That's what we do in our stories. But we started with other dimensions, with epistemic dimensions. But now that I think we can do pattern analysis in kids, a great effort, I think we could go back to addressing that question. Okay, and then the other question that Darko asked is a hard problem, which is, as many of you may have heard, this way of measuring theory of mind, which involves asking kids to talk about what other people think. So asking them to make explicit judgments where they have to explain actions, make predictions, gives you the pattern I showed you here, which is slow incremental development over pretty much the whole course of childhood. But there's another way to measure what kids know about other minds, and that is to use their pattern of looking in response to these scenarios. So instead of asking them to say anything or do anything, you just ask, where do they look? So where do they look, and also how long do they look, as a measure of their surprise or interest. And using those measures, these very spontaneous and hands-off measures, people have shown that kids have some understanding of other people's false beliefs as young as 8 months. So that's what's called a décalage, a difference in the measure of kids' knowledge and capacity of 5 years, right, between saying they know it at 8 months and saying they know it at 5 years. And it's one of the big mysteries about theory of mind right now. How should we understand that décalage? And people have been tempted to say, throw out all the older kid data. That's all something wrong with the paradigm. It's only the infant looking time data we should believe. Or throw out all the looking time data from the infants. Who knows what looking time measures anyway? It's only the data from the performance task that we should believe. And then other people have been inclined to say, no, let's just give them different names. The thing that you measure with looking time, we'll call that implicit. And the thing that you measure with explanations and predictions, we'll call that explicit, which I think is just renaming the problem. So I have argued that we should not do any of those. We should not dump any of the data. All of the data are good and replicable. And we should not simply rename the problem. We need to actually confront it. So there's some difference in the knowledge that is needed to solve false belief tasks as measured by looking time versus as measured in these explicit tasks. And I think this is, in some ways, the most open, outstanding question about theory of mind right now. There are ways potentially that neuroscience could contribute to it, for example, by asking whether the same neural systems are implicated in both those kinds of knowledge. That's the kind of thing we and others are interested in trying to do. But basically, my feeling is that right now we know less about theory of mind than we have ever known in my whole career. Yeah.
So most of the tasks presented before the reason we asked the question at the end. So have you looked at what is the difference between like passive listening tasks and sort of tasks that are an expected response?
I have. And it makes no difference whatsoever. The only thing you need to do is engage the participant. They can't be asleep. But you can engage them in any way you want. So you can engage them, you can just tell them, listen carefully. That works. But you can also say, at the end of this entire experiment, I'm going to ask you some things about the people in the stories. You can also get their attention on something relatively low level. Like you can say, at the end of every story, I'm going to give you one word. You have to tell me, was that word in the story or not? We've done it that way. You can ask them moral judgments. You can ask them theory of mind judgments. You can ask them pretty much anything. As long as they are engaged listening in the story and not asleep, you will get this activation. Lisa.
A general question that maybe is not specific to theory of mind or moral judgments. So in one piece of your talk, you had this nice test of this compensatory hypothesis, right? Which strikes me as a place where cognitive science education could be very interested in using this neuroscience tool. So to test whether the ways in which one arrives at the answer are different, et cetera. So in your own work or in other people's work, has this been a useful tool for sleuthing out that kind of differentiating processes, or do you see it as useful in that sort of?
That is a great question. So that is, of course, so just to rephrase the question for anybody who didn't hear it, the second section of my talk started with a failed hypothesis, which was the hypothesis that people with autism were performing equivalently on false belief tasks, but doing so via different neural mechanisms. And there's a bigger picture idea here, which is that the way cognitive neuroscience might be able to really make a contribution to cognitive science problems is in cases where the behavioral measures are the same, right? You have matched performance, but there's a hypothesis of different routes to the same answer. And exactly what cognitive neuroscience ought to be able to do is test the hypothesis that people are using different routes to get to the same answer. So I think that, and then Lisa asked, okay, so that was a hypothesis that you tested and found no evidence. Is there any other case where there is evidence for this idea of different routes to the same answer? And I think that is a great question. I'm not coming up with a good example right now. There's other cases where we've tested two alternative possible routes and found evidence for one as opposed to the other. But the idea that there would be two populations who get to the same answer via different routes feels like something there should be examples of. And feels like a really important thing you might discover. And I'm not coming up with good examples of it on the fly. I'll think about that. I'm coming back to you. Oh, you also asked a question. Yeah, at the back.
Might be a little off the wall. I want to ask if you have considered, or maybe you can guide me to research on what I call extraneural sources of influence on the theory of mind. And the one I'm thinking of is hormones, like oxytocin, vasopressin. Either those hormones have genetic bases, for example, but also you can you can inhale vasopressin safely. And I'm just wondering if you thought about, are there data on influences of that on
Absolutely. Yeah, hormonal influences. Yeah, so one of the things I didn't say is that early on when people were looking at deficits specific to social cognition, it wasn't obvious that those deficits should be neural. They quite plausibly could have been hormonal because many social functions are driven by hormonal rather than neural processes. So the question was, have people studied the influence of social hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin on things like theory of mind? So the closest that we've come is not exactly on the kinds of theory of mind tasks that I'm talking about, but on empathy tasks. So where you're asked how much you empathize for a thing that happened to somebody, and in particular, empathy across group boundaries. So one of the things in a separate line of research I didn't talk about today, one of the things we found in my lab is that empathy that is across boundaries, in particular in the context of competition. So if you and another group are competing for a resource, there is, unsurprisingly, a dramatic reduction in your empathy for even competition-irrelevant bad things that happen to members of that competing group. We've shown that the individual differences that govern that effect, so the parochialism of your empathy, are completely orthogonal to individual differences in empathy in general. So some people are super empathetic and super parochial. So it's a different process that governs how much empathy you feel for somebody when they're competing against you versus how much empathy you feel in general towards people. Okay, and then, so our group hasn't studied that with respect to oxytocin, but other groups have. And the oxytocin, as you know, has this reputation in the public of the love hormone, right? Take oxytocin and you'll feel more empathy and you'll be more generous and more altruistic and so on. And so one of the things that the research tested is, does oxytocin increase empathy for everyone? And there's clear evidence that that is not the case. Oxytocin increases empathy for the people you view as inside your circle or inside your in-group, and decreases empathy for people that you view as external or in a competing group. Consistent, actually, with the way oxytocin works in child rearing. Oxytocin drives protective behavior towards the den and towards young, but actually more aggressive behavior towards potential intruders. And so oxytocin is part of the evidence, along with neural evidence, the behavioral evidence that we've collected, that we should think of empathy towards outsiders or potential intruders as governed by really different processes from empathy towards insiders and in-group members. Yeah. Wow. So I'm a neuroscientist, and I study the way that human behavior and cognition, including the most abstract aspects of cognition, the things that are most central to our sense of self, the way those are implemented by neural systems. And I am particularly struck, both impressed and devastated, by the ways in which neural interventions or neural damage can change and dismantle the aspects of our mind that seem more central to ourselves. So when I think about things like abstract judgment, planning, emotional relationships, personality, all of the things that drive how we experience ourselves and how we relate to other people and how we value our world, I think about the ways in which intervening on the brain is sufficient to completely transform those functions. And that makes me think that a neural explanation, if we ever understood it, would be a complete explanation of even the most deep and abstract aspects of ourselves. That, to me, is the most astounding thought, right? The thought that not only our simple motor actions, but even our most central experiences of the self really are, in some sense, constituted by a pattern of neural firing in space and time. And that idea is part of why I get up in the morning to do the work I do. Yeah? Great. Yeah, those are both great questions. So there's a little bit of research on that. So the first, sorry, to rephrase the question, there are two, I think, quite different questions. The first question is that in all of the theory of mind research that I told you about, this is always fairly depersonalized. So it's you thinking about two characters thinking about each other, no implications for the self. And the context in which we experience really caring what other people think is almost always, what do other people think about me, right? That's the context in which other people's thoughts matter the most to us. The question is, do we know anything about the neural mechanisms or neural changes that, for example, govern social anxiety about what other people think about me? And I think those are great questions. There's a little bit of research on that, specifically looking at adolescence, because in adolescence, it seems like basic social cognition in adolescence is pretty similar to adults, but sensitivity to cues about what others think about the self is much more enhanced or exaggerated in adolescence. And so people who study the development of these brain regions in adolescence have been interested in developing tasks where you're getting feedback about the self from other people, and some evidence of, for example, heightened activity in adolescence to that kind of information. I have thought about trying to study that kind of thing, but have not done so yet. So that's the first question. The second question is, I'm talking about us thinking about minds, and there's a question of what's a mind, right? So the targets of the reasoning in all of the tasks I showed you are other human beings who are the paradigm example of beings with a mind, other people. But there's obviously a spectrum of what you might consider a mind, and that has also been the focus of a lot of research in psychology recently, is our naive theory. What is our naive theory about who has a mind and what counts as a mind? And the evidence suggests that when we think about other minds, we think predominantly about two dimensions of mind. One dimension which has been called experience, which is, for example, the capacity to suffer, to experience pain, to perceive the world, to be conscious. And attributing a mind like that governs moral judgments about whether you can be harmed morally, whether something that harms you is a moral harm. So, for example, babies are judged to be high on experience in the sense that they experience the world, they can suffer, and if somebody harms a baby, they are judged to have done something morally wrong. And the other dimension is agency, the capacity to plan, to be responsible for your actions, to choose deliberately. And that is associated with the capacity to be blamed. So a baby is very low on agency. If a baby harms somebody, we don't blame them. Even though if somebody harms a baby, we blame the person who did the harming. And robots are usually viewed as the opposite case to the baby. That is, they're viewed as high in agency, potentially, maybe the robots of the future, like C-3PO, that if a robot causes harm, they might potentially be blamable, but it's not viewed that they could experience suffering. That's the lay conception. And you can place many other entities, like fish and reptiles, et cetera, on this dimensional space and characterize how much of these two potentially distinct dimensions of mind we attribute to them. Slightly disturbingly, this brings out all kinds of weird dimensions of our perceptions of people. So if you ask, for example, where on these two dimensions do you put, for example, men versus women, you find that on the whole, people judge women as having more experience but less agency, and men having more agency and less experience, which leads to all kinds of weird moral judgments. Okay, so that's the dimensional spectrum. And then the question is, okay, these brain regions, are they engaged when you're thinking about the mental states of something that isn't a human being, but that might be viewed as having mental states? We've tested that in a limited range of cases, and so far what I believe from our data is that it's about whether you're attributing mental states, not about the target of the attribution at all. So if you guys have seen the Pixar lamp, you know, the lamp gets going and then we're able to see the lamp as a parent lamp and everything else. Once you're attributing all those mental states, it doesn't matter that it's a lamp. That's theory of mind being engaged. And another way of saying that is our theory of mind capacity is very promiscuous. It will be applied to anything, and once you apply it, then these brain regions are going. Yeah. I know you had a question, Justin.
So one thing I really liked about this talk, that it presented, I think, an alternative way of thinking about implications and relevance to the classroom and other things more broadly than even you highlighted in the end. So in the end, you turned your focus a little bit. You mentioned deaf individuals being raised by signers or non-signers, and you talked about intervention for the case of ASD spectrum. So you could look at that side of the issue, but you could also look at another part of your talk, which is that, say, from the 5 to the 8-year-olds and the adult stuff, that suggests that rather than thinking about ASD as some type of dysfunction, rather all of us are dysfunctional. And the developmental time course is long and protracted, and it seems to involve something of having teacher signals, so the trade-off between consequentialism and focus on intention that comes up even in the TMS for the adults, right? You see that same trade-off is still happening throughout development. And then ask, okay, well, what's the impact on the normal course of development from reflecting on these different situations like signers, non-signers,
right, absolutely,
or ASD individuals being integrated into an integrated classroom. So
right, and maybe one way of rephrasing this. Okay. Okay.
Which is the whole reason for this question.
Okay.
Which is, I remember being a second grader, and my brother brought a friend over, and the friend is deaf. And this was in a place that we hadn't lived for very long. And we all ended up playing basketball together. And I kept calling for the ball. I was on the friend's team. And he wouldn't pass it to me. And I had to go through this process of realizing, oh, he only knows I'm calling for it if I'm facing him. So I had to change my whole style of basketball play. Like instead of staying away from my brother, I had to instead get to the face of my teammate so that he could see me calling for the ball. And being in that situation, I think, I've thought about that many times throughout my life, that intervention that occurred for me.
Absolutely.
And probably had a positive impact on my understanding of other minds.
Right, so there's a local version and a global version of this question, just for people who didn't hear it. So one thing is, Justin was telling a story about being faced with an individual who has different access. So in this case, faced with an individual who's deaf, and how that forces you to consider the different perspectives and different access that that person has as a teaching signal. So we've considered this possibility in that particular case, and other people have as well, that you could think of, if you think, who might be the most likely to develop expertise in reasoning about different access or different experience, that one thing might be typically developing children of deaf or blind adults. Because if you have a sibling, if you have a parent or a sibling experiencing the world in a really different way from you, then you spend all day in your home and family life negotiating what information is accessible to somebody who does or doesn't have access to this information. And so we, among other people, have thought about testing the hypothesis that CODAs, so hearing children of deaf adults or children of blind adults, might, with all of that practice, become, in a sense, theory of mind experts. There's a little bit of behavioral evidence from Jenny Pyers that actually is an intervention and might work. But there's, I think, the bigger picture question here, which is, how teachable is theory of mind? So one of the things I said early on is that theory of mind predicts a lot of outcomes that really matter. So early measures of theory of mind predict resilience, they predict school readiness, they predict peer interactions. They're also related to developmental outcomes in autism. And both for autistic kids, but I think especially for typical kids, we want to know, how much can we intervene on that? Can we help kids to be better positioned with respect to all of those outcomes? And I think that is unknown, how teachable these skills are, in part because they're so stable over long term, so not only in our data, but in many other data sets. Measures of theory of mind at age 2 are predictive of theory of mind at age 5 and even later. So there's some very stable individual difference, which might be bad news for an intervention, but not necessarily. Many things are stable and teachable. And so I think that the bigger question for applications is, these skills which predict all kinds of outcomes, can you intervene on them early and affect all of those outcomes? And I think that is a deep and unknown question.